welcome to the William TD channel. The doors of the police station swung open with a force that echoed down the corridor. A tall man with a piercing gaze stepped inside. This was Thomas Caldwell, the chief of Chicago police, and he was furious. And one video changed everything. Morning in St. Louis was warm and humid, with the sun slowly rising above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The air carried the scent of fresh asphalt after the night's rain, and a few cars passed by on streets not yet awakened by the day's bustle. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed lazily, while a gentle breeze carried the faint sounds of the city morning. Two young men, Jaden and Marcus, students from the University of Illinois in Chicago, walked along the sidewalk after their morning run. Jaden was tall and lean, with short curly hair and a thoughtful gaze, while Marcus was stockier, with a slight smile always ready to break across his face. Their gray athletic shirts clung to their bodies with sweat, and their breathing hadn't yet fully recovered from the intense run. They had come here for a summer internship in architecture, studying historic buildings in the American South. But this day was supposed to start with something simple, a bottle of mineral water from the local corner store. The bell on the door jingled as they entered. The store was tiny, with wooden shelves packed with groceries and an old cash register that made a soft clicking sound with each press of a button. Behind the counter stood the elderly store owner, a man in his 50s with deep wrinkles on his face and a tired expression. He gave them a brief nod while wiping down a glass display, his gesture more mechanical than welcoming. "Good morning, sir," Jaden greeted politely, picking up a cold bottle of water. The coolness in his hand brought a brief sense of relief. "Morning," the store owner muttered, casting them a glance as if evaluating whether they had a right to be there. Marcus paid, and the two headed for the door, quietly chatting. But the moment they stepped outside, a group of local troublemakers surrounded them. Three young men lazily blocked their path. There was something predatory in their posture, an unspoken desire to assert dominance. "Look what we have here," one of them drawled with a smirk. He was tall, with dark eyes filled with an unsettling curiosity. "New around here, or just lost?" "We're just leaving the store, man," Marcus replied calmly, though his voice carried an undertone of caution. He could feel the tension building, like the electric charge in the air before a storm. "Where you all dressed like that? Think you're better than us?" another one chimed in, clenching and unclenching his fists. Marcus didn't even have time to respond before he was shoved in the chest. He stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, throwing the aggressors a dark glare. "We don't want any trouble," Jaden said, trying to keep things peaceful. "We didn't ask what you want," the third guy scoffed, before unexpectedly punching Jaden in the face. It all happened too fast. Marcus lunged to shield his friend, but they grabbed him and threw him against the store's glass window. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed in the morning light. From inside the store, an outraged voice shouted, "What the hell?" The shop owner rushed outside, staring at his broken window in shock. "What did you do?" The two young men struggled to get up, blood trickling from cuts on their arms. The group around them laughed loudly, but then a voice suddenly cut through the noise. "Hey, the cops are on their way." A girl had called out from the bus stop across the street. Her name was Sophie. Tall, with long chestnut hair, she wore a light summer dress. She had watched the situation unfold with horror, but quickly pulled herself together. Her heart pounded, but she couldn't just stand by. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "There's a fight at the store on the corner of Lexington Avenue. 4 guys jumped too." Her voice was firm, filled with determination. The moment the words left her mouth, the gang scattered. The attackers vanished into the alleyways as if they had never been there. Sophie ran toward the two young men. "Are you guys okay?" Jaden slowly got to his feet, wiping blood from his split lip. Marcus looked at her, his hands shaking. "Thanks, you didn't have to step in." "And who would have if I didn't?" Sophie shot back sharply. She turned toward the store owner, who was still frowning at the shattered window. "Those thugs attacked them, and you didn't even call for help." The shopkeeper scowled, clearly unhappy about being dragged into the situation. I don't want any trouble. The trouble is already here, she snapped. You should have called the cops. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Sophie looked back at the guys, her eyes filled with determination. I'll give my statement. I saw everything. Marcus managed a weak smile, gratitude evident in his gaze. But so was an understanding. This wasn't over yet. They were in a city where they were seen as outsiders, and who knew how this would end for them? Events on the street were unfolding rapidly. The wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the morning air. 2 police cars screeched to a halt in front of the store, and 4 officers stepped out. Their dark blue uniforms gleamed in the rising sunlight, their hands resting near their belts, dangerously close to their holsters. The lead officer, a tall, light-skinned man in his 40s with short blonde hair and a cold stare, surveyed the scene. His badge glinted on his chest, and his face was set in an expression of disdainful superiority. Yo, got him. Who said who, Gust? He asked, his gaze sliding over Jaden and Marcus. They were still recovering from the fight, but knew they couldn't expect any help from these men. The store owner immediately stepped forward, pointing at them. Beans too, they broke the window, attacked someone, looked suspicious from the start. Are you serious? Sophie exclaimed, stepping forward. They were attacked. They didn't start this. The officer turned his head toward her, studying her slowly, as if deciding whether her words were even worth considering. Then he looked back at the guys. All right, hands on the hood now, he commanded. His partners moved in, reaching for their handcuffs. Fuck. Marcus tried to take a step back, but a rough shove to his chest sent him sprawling onto the car's hood. We didn't do anything. Jaden raised his hands, but the officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. Shut up, one of the cops hissed, gripping his wrist so tightly that Jaden clenched his teeth in pain. Are you kidding me? Sophie yelled. I was right here. I saw everything. Why don't you believe them? And what are you, their lawyer? The second officer sneered. He was white, with light mustache and a glint of malice in his eyes. Maybe your friends here really are innocent, but are you willing to stake your life on it? Because we have other witnesses. What witnesses? Sophie was seething with anger. Well, for example, Mr. The officer glanced at the store owner. John, the man muttered, crossing his arms. Sir John here says he saw these 2 acting suspicious. Then, broken glass, chaos. What are we supposed to think? He leaned in closer to Jaden. You boys got any ID on you? Marcus and Jaden exchanged glances. They had only gone out for a morning run. Who carries ID for that? No, Marcus said quietly. Well, there you have it, the officer smirked triumphantly. Listen, they don't have ID because they're not criminals, Sophie snapped. They're students. From Chicago, I can vouch for them. We don't need your stories, lady, the lead officer barked. We're here to keep order, and these 2, he shook his head. They're trouble. I can see it from a mile away. Marcus felt like he was suffocating from anger. They had done nothing, absolutely nothing, and yet they were already being labeled as guilty. This was St. Louis 2023, but in that moment it felt like they had been thrown back into another era. The way the cops looked at them, spoke to them, their whole demeanor screamed, "You're guilty just for being born with your skin color." We need a lawyer, Marcus gritted out, trying to stay calm. Oh, that's not your concern anymore, the officer smirked, yanking his arms back and snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. Something inside Jaden snapped. He couldn't let this happen. What about the cameras? He shouted. The store cameras. They'll prove we're innocent. The store owner frowned, hesitated, but quickly composed himself. The camera wasn't working today. Broken. Silence. Marcus closed his eyes. Of course. The camera wasn't working. How convenient. The officers exchanged glances. Then the lead cop signaled to his men. Take them in. We'll sort it out at the station. You have no right, Sophie shouted, rushing forward. I'll file a complaint. I'll tell the whole city what you did. And who exactly are you going to complain to, sweetheart? The officer chuckled. Might have to take that phone of yours too if you keep making a fuss." Sophie clenched her fists. She was shaking with rage. She couldn't just stand by and watch as these guys were accused of something they didn't do. But what could she do against cops who had already decided they were guilty? Officer Hank's rough voice cut through the air. "Hands behind your backs, don't move." Harsh hands gripped Jaden and Marcus, tightening around their wrists like steel traps. The handcuffs clicked shut with a metallic clang, the cold steel biting into their skin. The boys were shoved forward roughly, forced to walk toward the police car. Jaden stumbled, but a harsh yank from an officer steadied him. "Move it, what are you standing around for?" barked another cop, young but with a voice already sharpened by cruelty. Marcus glared at him but said nothing. He knew that any word could make things worse. They were shoved into the car, the doors slamming shut behind them, cutting them off from the night air. The inside of the vehicle smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and something else. An almost imperceptible scent of fear. The car started moving, and the streets blurred past the window. Jaden tried to steady his breathing. His lip was swollen from the punch, and the handcuffs dug painfully into his wrists. "Shit," he muttered under his breath, resting his head against the seat. Marcus, sitting beside him, clenched his jaw. He couldn't shake the thought. They were the victims, yet they were the ones being treated as criminals. "How do you like your little ride in a police car?" came the mocking voice of Officer Hanks from the front seat. The cop behind the wheel chuckled. "Better get used to it, boys. Next time it'll be a one-way trip." Marcus's head snapped up. "Is that a threat?" Hanks turned, his icy blue eyes glinting in the dim glow of the dashboard. "No, kid. It's a promise." The car veered toward the precinct. The officers smirked. One of them grinned. The police car came to a sharp stop in front of the station, brakes screeching. Red and blue lights flashed in the windshield, casting surreal reflections on the gray concrete walls. Jaden and Marcus sat in the back, wrists burning from the tight cuffs. Their breathing was heavy, their thoughts tangled. As the car rolled into the precinct's lot, the flashing lights reflected in shop windows, illuminating their faces. They were being taken somewhere they were already presumed guilty. When the car stopped, the doors flung open again. "Move," an officer ordered, yanking Marcus out. He stumbled but managed to stay on his feet. "I can't walk fast, my leg hurts," he snapped, but the cop only sneered. "Then crawl if you have to, we don't care." Jaden was shoved out next. He wanted to say something, but the cold stare of the lead officer silenced him. The man was tall, with narrow, pale blue eyes and a square jaw. His name was etched on his badge, Officer Hanks. His subordinates, 3 younger officers, seemed to mirror his behavior, following his lead without question. "Search them," Hanks ordered. Marcus and Jaden were roughly pushed against the wall, hands up. The pat-down was humiliating, the officers clearly relishing the moment. "Clear," one of them muttered. "Of course we're clear," Jaden spat, turning his head angrily. "We're not criminals." Hanks let out a low chuckle. "And who decides that, kid?" He stepped closer, looming over him. "Think saying the right words changes anything?" Marcus clenched his fists. "Are we at least getting medical attention?" he ground out. The officers exchanged glances and burst into laughter. They shoved them forward. A heavy door slammed shut behind them, cutting them off from the outside world. The precinct smelled of stale coffee, sweat, and cheap disinfectant. Somewhere in a distant cell, someone tapped monotonously against metal bars. They were led down a narrow corridor and shoved into a small holding cell with peeling walls. No bed, just a wooden bench and a tiny barred window near the ceiling. "Get comfortable, boys," one of the officers sneered, slamming the door shut. Marcus sat down, breathing heavily. The blood on his arm had dried, but the pain lingered. Jaden sat beside him, resting his head against the wall. Minutes dragged. The clock ticked. Officers passed by several times, casting glances at them. One of them ate a donut right in front of their cell, smirking when Jaden and Marcus looked his way. I need my phone call, Marcus suddenly said, standing up. He stepped toward the bars, knocking on them. I have a right to a phone call. A response. Hey, I have the right to a phone call, he shouted louder. Hours passed. Marcus refused to stop, repeating his demand again and again. The officers grew tired of hearing it. Finally, one of them rolled his eyes. Fine, whatever, one call, he muttered, pulling out the phone and leading Marcus to a desk. Not that your lawyer's going to help you. Marcus took the phone. His hands were shaking. He dialed the number. The ringing dragged on painfully long. Then, finally, someone picked up. Hello? A voice answered. Marcus swallowed hard, then forced the words out. It's me. I need your help. Silence on the other end. The officers stood nearby, watching. They clearly didn't expect this call to change anything. They were sure he had no chance. Marcus took a deep breath, gripping the phone tighter in his sweaty hands. The cell was stifling, the air heavy with sweat and stale odors. His heart pounded like a trapped animal. He heard the voice on the other end of the line, low, confident, filled with authority. Coins, hello? The voice was firm, steady. Uncle Thomas? It's Marcus? We need help? His voice shook slightly, but he held himself together. Silence. The ringing had stopped, but there was no immediate response. A cold shiver ran down Marcus's spine. He knew Thomas Cross, the chief of police in Chicago, was not the kind of man to leave his nephew in trouble. But how would he react? Would he believe him? Where are you? Came the hard question at last. We were detained in St. Louis. Marcus licked his dry lips. Uncle, they're treating us like criminals. We didn't do anything. I swear, these cops, they wouldn't even let us speak. His voice broke, and he clenched his jaw. Breathe, kid. Thomas's voice softened, but there was a controlled fury beneath it. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Marcus gave a quick rundown, starting with the attack outside the store. He spoke fast, making sure not to leave anything out. How the cops had twisted their arms, accused them. How the store owner had lied, saying they had started the fight. How they were shoved into the police car, humiliated on the way, locked up in a cell like trash. And how only now, after hours, they were finally allowed this one call. Another silence on the other end. Then a deep inhale. Who's in charge at that station? Thomas's voice was dangerously calm. Officer Hanks, Marcus spat out. That bastard is enjoying every second of this. Thomas Cross was a composed man, but Marcus knew his uncle was seething. Listen to me carefully, Thomas began. You're my nephew, but that doesn't matter. This is about justice. I won't let them treat you like garbage. I'll be on the first flight to St. Louis, and if any one of those bastards tries anything else, they'll regret it. Marcus swallowed hard, but felt hope flare in his chest. Thank you, Uncle. I didn't know who else to call. You made the right choice, kid. Thomas's voice was solid as granite now. Stay strong. I'm coming. After the call, Marcus and Jaden were led into the interrogation room. The harsh glare of the lamp hit Jaden's eyes, making him squint. The room was cramped, the air thick with tobacco smoke, sweat, and staleness. The smell of stale coffee and cheap deodorant lingered, but beyond all that, there was something even more oppressive. The scent of fear soaked into the walls of this interrogation room. Officer Hanks sat across from him, his massive figure unnaturally still, arms crossed over his chest, his icy blue eyes drilling into Jaden as if seeing right through him. In the corner, silent but clearly intrigued, stood another officer, a stocky man with sharp facial features who occasionally shook his head, as if smirking to himself. I'll repeat the question. Hank's voice was calm, almost lazy, which only made it more threatening. Who started the fight? Jaden swallowed, his mouth dry, but he didn't look away. I already told you. We didn't start it. We defended ourselves. Hanks raised an eyebrow, then leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. You want me to believe that? His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. Two black kids caught in the middle of a disturbance, and you're telling me it's just a coincidence? Come on, kid, you're not stupid. We both know how this works. Jaden felt the anger boiling inside him, but he forced himself not to show it. We did nothing wrong, he repeated, now with more confidence in his voice. Hank scoffed and leaned back in his chair, glancing at the silent officer. They might always say that, don't they? He asked with a smirk. Always, the officer muttered, crossing his arms. Hank shook his head, feigning disappointment. All right, have it your way, he said, slowly rising. Let's see how long you last without food and water. Maybe then your memory will clear up. Jaden clenched his teeth but didn't say another word. The officers left, leaving him alone. The air was colder in the next room, and the light seemed even harsher. The chair beneath Marcus creaked with every movement, as if reminding him how unstable his situation was. The officer sitting across from him looked older than Hank's, his face worn but his gaze sharp. You two committed a crime, he stated without looking up from his papers. This can be settled quickly. Just sign a confession and you'll get a minimal sentence. Marcus smirked. A minimal sentence for something we didn't do? Fantastic. The officer set the papers aside and looked at him with mild irritation. Let's be straight with each other. You think you have a choice? The store owner already gave his statement. The store is wrecked, and all the evidence points to you. What evidence? Marcus smirked wider. That we were just there? The officer frowned, then leaned in closer. You're not stupid, so listen carefully. No one is going to sort this out. We have a case, we have charges, and everything fits. Do you understand how this works? No one is going to look for the real culprits. You and your friend are perfect candidates, and trust me, the judge won't hesitate. Marcus stared him straight in the eyes, his smile disappearing. He knew the officer was telling the truth. They weren't interested in the truth. They had already decided who was guilty. But there was one thing they didn't know. Marcus leaned forward and said slowly, clearly, You better hurry up with those charges because my uncle is already on his way, and when he gets here, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. Silence filled the room. The officer straightened, his expression changing slightly. Marcus caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Maybe for the first time that night, something wasn't going according to their plan. He crossed his arms and leaned back, pretending not to care, but Marcus knew a crack had appeared. After the interrogation, they were led back to the cell without a word. Jaden and Marcus were exhausted, but they held their ground. The door clanged shut, and the echo of the officer's footsteps faded down the hall. Well, how is that? Marcus muttered, sitting down on the cold bench against the wall. Jaden leaned against the bars, staring into the void. He felt a cold sweat running down his back. All this time he had tried to hold on, not to show fear. But now that they were alone, the tension caught up with him. They're not even trying to find the truth, he said quietly. Marcus clenched his jaw. They found convenient suspects, two black kids in the right place at the right time. Why would they bother investigating? The silence in the cell was oppressive. The dim overhead light flickered, casting trembling shadows on the walls. The sense of helplessness was unbearable. Do you think your uncle will come? Jaden finally asked. Marcus shook his head, but not in doubt. I know he will, he said firmly. The question is, how long will it take? Jaden closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I hope not too long. Minutes stretched endlessly. Somewhere beyond the precinct walls a phone rang. Someone laughed loudly, but here in the cell, time seemed to stand still. Marcus got up and began pacing the cramped space. They're waiting for us to break, he said, not looking at his friend. For us to beg, to confess. Never, Jaden muttered. Marcus stopped and looked at him. Never, he repeated. An hour passed, then another. Sleep wouldn't come. The waiting stretched like a thick fog, impossible to clear. But despite the cold, the exhaustion, and the fear of the unknown, one thing remained certain. Justice would find them. All they had to do was wait. The police station carried on with its usual routine. Officers lazily drank coffee, discussed the latest news, and filled out reports without rushing to finish their shift. Everything changed in an instant. The doors burst open with such force that the sound echoed down the corridor. A tall man with a piercing gaze stepped inside. His impeccably tailored suit, upright posture, and confident stride immediately marked him as a man accustomed to command. This was Thomas Caldwell, the chief of police in Chicago, and he was furious. "Where are they?" His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. The duty sergeant, startled, lifted his head from his cup of coffee and awkwardly jumped to his feet. "Excuse me, sir, who exactly?" Jaden Carter and Marcus Caldwell. Thomas's voice struck like a hammer. "Where are they?" The sergeant hesitated, exchanging glances with his colleagues. This was not a man with whom bureaucratic games could be played. They're in the holding cell, sir. We detained them on charges of vandalism." "Charges?" Thomas leaned forward. "Did you conduct an investigation? Collect evidence?" The sergeant swallowed nervously. "Yeah. Officer Hanks is handling the case, sir." "Excellent," Thomas nodded. "Bring him here, now." A tense silence filled the room. A few minutes later, two officers emerged into the hall, followed by Jaden and Marcus. Exhausted, yet still holding themselves with dignity. Marcus, upon seeing his uncle, barely contained his emotions. "Uncle." Thomas gave a barely perceptible nod, but his gaze immediately locked onto Officer Hanks. "You interrogated these boys?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Hanks replied stiffly. "Without coercion, without evidence," Thomas stated coldly. His piercing stare seemed to see right through the officers, exposing not only their fear but also their realization of their mistake. The interrogation room fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the hum of the monitors. "You set up two innocent students without even attempting a proper investigation," Thomas continued. "Now explain to me why." Hanks clenched his jaw, his confidence slowly evaporating. He knew arguing was pointless, but tried to maintain his composure. "We had witness statements," he began, but Thomas cut him off sharply. "Witnesses? You mean the store owner who changed his story once he realized the situation wasn't going in his favor, or the young woman who actually saw the attackers, whose testimony you chose to ignore, or perhaps you're referring to the security camera footage that you didn't even bother to check." Thomas had already obtained the footage and knew exactly what he was talking about. He fixed Hanks with an unyielding gaze, pulled out a flash drive and inserted it into a laptop. Within seconds, the truth was displayed on the screen. The recording clearly showed Jaden and Marcus not as the instigators of the chaos, but as victims of circumstance. "This footage would have been enough to drop all charges," Thomas said calmly, "if you had done your job from the start. But you didn't." Hanks averted his eyes while the second officer swallowed hard. The tension in the air was suffocating. "They're free to go," Thomas ordered, his eyes still locked onto Hanks. Immediately, the junior officer hastily nodded and rushed to process the paperwork. Within minutes, the cell doors swung open and Jaden and Marcus stepped out to freedom. "That's it?" Marcus asked quietly, looking at his uncle. His voice carried a pain hidden behind forced patience. Thomas patted his shoulder. "Not yet," he said. "We're going to see this through to the end." He turned to Hanks. "Expect an internal investigation, and if it turns out this isn't the first time you've treated detainees this way—" Thomas paused, letting the tension build. "You won't just lose your badge. I'll make sure you're held accountable." Hanks opened his mouth to argue, but quickly shut it again. He knew he had lost. Jaden and Marcus, after everything they had been through, felt relief, but also anger. Anger that the system allowed men like Hanks to abuse their power. Anger that they could have been broken if not for Thomas. But now that justice had prevailed, they knew one thing. They wouldn't stop fighting. Never. As they stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the cloudy sky. It felt symbolic. A new day, a new chance. But the story wasn't over. Now they had a purpose, and they were ready to fight. Marcus and Jaden filed a lawsuit against the officers who had arrested them. The trial did not take long. Video recordings and witness testimonies became undeniable evidence of the officers' guilt. The prosecution brought charges of abuse of power, evidence falsification, and unlawful detention. However, the process was not easy. The defense tried to maneuver, justifying the actions of the police as a necessity of duty. But the truth was on Marcus and Jaden's side. The courtroom was tense. Reporters, activists, and representatives of public organizations closely followed the case. Marcus and Jaden sat in the front row, their faces calm, yet inside the injustice they had endured still burned. Their gazes occasionally met with Thomas's, who stood like a rock on the side of law and justice. Hanks and his partner sat on the defendant's bench, no longer as confident as they had been that night when they threw two innocent students behind bars without any evidence. Their lawyers tried to build a defense, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. When the surveillance footage was played, clearly showing how they had abused their power, their expressions changed. In their eyes, the realization of the inevitable appeared. The judge announced the verdict: guilty. They were dismissed from duty and later sentenced to prison terms, along with a lifetime ban from working in law enforcement. When the verdict was read, a heavy silence hung in the courtroom, followed by applause from those who had fought for justice. Thomas felt no satisfaction. For him, this was not revenge, but a necessity, to show that the system could work fairly if one fought for the truth. This was one of the rare moments when justice had prevailed, but he knew that much work still lay ahead. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the air was fresh and free. Marcus, looking at his uncle, finally asked, "You won't stop, will you?" Thomas smiled slightly and looked into the distance, toward the horizon, where many more battles for truth awaited him. Never. Several months had passed since the court's verdict. The story of Marcus and Jaden had become a symbol of the fight against injustice. Their case sparked widespread discussions about police misconduct and bias in the justice system. Activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens began demanding reforms, and some officers, seeing the consequences of abusing power, started to reflect on what true justice should be. Marcus and Jaden returned to their studies, but they were no longer just students. They began speaking at public gatherings, sharing their experiences and encouraging people not to be afraid to speak the truth. Thomas, remaining in his position, dedicated even more time to fighting corruption within the system, knowing that one victorious case was not enough to eradicate the problem. The world did not change overnight, but a step had been taken, and that step was important, because every voice raised against injustice can become the beginning of change. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell your own story, and of course, drop a like if you enjoyed it. See you in the next video.